In my previous review, we went into Flying Lotus full feature film directorial with Ash, and today we look into a film from another VHS alumni with Iranian-American director Natasha Kermani's adaptation of Abraham Boyce from a short story from author Joe Hill. The story encompassed Dr. Abraham Van Helsing's relocation to America years after taking down Count Dracula in Eastern Europe. He started assuming the role of a medical doctor in a secluded homestead within the California Central Valley. Dr. Van Helsing and his wife Mina, who was the actual personification of Lily Rose Depp's character in Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, Alan Hunter, had the desire to live in peace and serenity with their two sons, Max and Rudy. Oh yes, it seems like in this Joe Hill's Imaginarium of the post-Dracula fallout, Van Helsing had snagged Mina under the breath of Jonathan Harker. In Singapore colloquial, he had Potonjalan Harker's girl for his own. Well, life after the travails of Europe was not fine and dandy, as both Abraham and Mina were suffering from some trauma haunting them, especially Mina, who was displaying pre-vampiric syndromes and the ensuing nightmares, which of course bothered her husband as well. As for the patriarch of the household, he was very aloof towards the attention of his wife and more importantly his sons. However, this was atypical of the father figure of that time period, or perhaps vanquishing his own version of Moby Dick in Count Dracula had left Van Helsing a husk of a medical doctor with an undying passion as a vampire hunter. Abraham seems to be holding his elder son Max to a standard which Max had failed to attain. He had been gaslighting on the teenager and even indirectly pitted the siblings to compete against one another. As Mina was slowly losing it, despite her husband's continual help to resurrect her health, there was something suspicious within Abraham's motives and actions, stretching even back to Europe. In a story which links so intrinsically to the lore of Dracula, there was that impending fear of the Prince of Darkness spreading his reach even after his demise. He also painted the real terror of dealing with the malevolent entity that led to that amount of trauma, haunting every single person involved, including Arthur Holmwood, the widower of one Lucy Westenra, who those who have known of the story was proclaimed by Van Helsing to be beaten by Dracula, and Holmwood was cajoled to put a stake through her heart. Holmwood's appearance in this movie revealed the fact that he had doubts whether Van Helsing had gaslit him to commit matricide. Joe Hill, famous novelist son of Stephen King, had written this short story in 2004, which focused a lot on Abraham Van Helsing as a flawed person and a father figure, and trying to pass down his legacy by force generally to his sons. The short story was compiled in the collection called 20th Century Ghost, with another famous story which was made into a live-action movie we all knew as The Black Phone. Having not caught up with her earlier movie Lucky from 2020, the only reference I had of previous Natasha Kermani's work was the segment TKNOGD from VHS 85, in which an avant-garde art presentation went awry when it lured something from the deep chasm of the unknown in technology. Abraham's voice was a stark contrast to that segment from VHS, yet you could see a pair of sound hands at play with unleashing the danger of humanity deep within. Jump scares were scarce, while the gore played out on screen was not overt as well. But whatever we gathered surely could leave a mark for the audience. Titus Welliver, who many would recognize as the actor that brought LAPD detective Harry Bosch to life on the long-running Amazon Prime series, assumed the role of Abraham Van Helsing. To be honest, it was a tough job for Welliver to suppress his natural charisma, unlike a Harry Bosch, and he played a solid Van Helsing who needed to put his family on a leash and in total control of things at home. In the role of Mina Van Helsing, we have Jocelyn Donahue, who came into prominence in Ty West's The House of the Devil in 2009. And looking through her filmography, Donahue is a sneaky royalty in the horror genre, featuring in movies like Insidious Chapter 2 and Doctor Sleep, just to name the prominent ones. In the role of Mina, Donahue gave the one performance that suited the gothic horror setting and atmosphere, and her interaction with the boys felt authentic. Not exactly a Nepo baby of the week, but we have a supporting character Elsie, who was sort of tormented mentally by the Van Helsing family in the climactic end, and she was played by Aurora Perrineau, the daughter of Herod of Lost, Romeo and Juliet, and 28 Weeks Later fame. I don't know if an adaptation of Abraham's Boys is truly required, as I felt it did not add much to the lore of Dracula. Still, it was a movie of solid filmmaking at the very least. This is a 6 out of 10 from me. Kermani's Abraham's Boys was a bit underwhelming, and I wanted something to saturate me and juice me up for this review. So, linking the whole vampire theme with the word boys in the title naturally led me to The Lost Boys by director Joel Schumacher from 1987. Single mother Lucy brought her boys, the older Michael and the younger Sam, to live with her father in the beach town of Santa Clara, California. The crowded boardwalk was so strategic to lure the boys with the sights and sounds of the amusement facilities and shops like video rental and comic books retailer filled to the brim with young people of all shapes, sizes and fashion statements. Michael, at the peak of his puberty, was mesmerized by a nubile and elusive figure by the name of Star. Even when he realized that Star was the muse of the leader of a local delinquent gang, David, and what unraveled on screen was like an updated version of Rebel with a Cause, before we realized that it was not Star that David was interested in, but Michael himself. Written by Janice Fisher, James Jeremias, and Jeffrey Boehm, this Richard Donner production company-made movie was directed by Joel Schumacher, who was still buzzing from being instrumental with the Brat Pack movement with Sam Elmo's Fire, and the youthful cast featured in this movie felt like Brat Pack's adjacents. It was stated that the screenwriters wanted to imagine a world of Peter Pan and the Lost Boys being vampires with immortal vampirism in the form of children. The script was patterned after Richard Donner's The Goonies, about young vampires being fended off by younger vampire hunters. When Richard Donner took over the executive producer role, he suggested a sexier version with the ages being elevated across the board, which worked a splendor. The movie, which still possessed a lot of nostalgic charm and an important piece of remnants from the 1980s for horror fans growing up during that time, with scenes like the stripper-like saxophonist and the brute hanging underneath the railway tracks being something still referenced often, even after nearly 4 decades on. From the prologue of the movie, we saw David's brute creating havoc to the people of Santa Clara Boardwalk and viewed as a scourge of society. Yet, there was something magnetic about the gang which worked in the innate charm of vampires, but as a scourge of society rather than an enigmatic baron in a reclusive castle. The gang resided in a secluded lair, which was a luxury hotel buried after the 1966 San Francisco earthquake, the location which obviously was a soundstage, but it gave the movie a memorable backdrop and also highlighted Schumacher's eye for aesthetics in his filmmaking, especially for his future Batman movie. It was so seamless for me to compare The Lost Boys to another 1980s vampire feature that catered to the younger audience of that time in Tom Holland's Fright Night from 1985. Both movies featured good-looking young casts who had a hard time convincing the adults of the threat of the undead and had to find help in an unconventional way. There was strong essence of the vampire lore, like using garlic and holy water to combat the threats in these movies, which helped to popularize the vampire lore among a whole new contingent of young audiences. These movies also illuminated with noteworthy songs instead of dreary orchestral tracks to give it a more contemporary feel. The main difference, of course, was Fright Night paid homage to the Castle films and their famous Dracula franchise, while The Lost Boys, as we stated, was meant to be more of a children's adventure comparable to the likes of The Goonies or Monster Squad. For yours truly, Fright Night was such an important horror film in my childhood, when I was being properly traumatized by the visuals like the vampire bride, as well as when Evil Ed was crying when he had turned into a vampire. The main theme still triggered some fear in me, despite it was an insanely enjoyable track. Watching The Lost Boys for the first time, I could feel many strengths in this movie had possessed over Fright Night. The script, filmmaking and performances on the whole felt slightly superior, but there was that lack of an overbearing antagonist in Chris Sheridan Jerry from Fright Night. Of course, Kiefer Sutherland's David would be comparable, but he was not the exact apple-to-apple comparison. Speaking of Sutherland, he had made his mark in Rob Reiner's Stand By Me by this point, and would be remembered for his villainous roles till the 1990s. As David, the leader of the gang with his platinum blonde mullet, he was the most memorable character in the film, be it his look or the character's arc. The vampire form likely be immortalized by fans of the dark literature, especially from the female fans. I like the dynamic of his brute, with the dark-haired and silent Dwayne acting as a second in command, and the more obnoxious blonde Paul, supported by the younger Marco, who felt like a trusted lieutenant for logistics, played of course by a young Alex Winter before he was Bill in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Our protagonist Michael is Jason Patric, who for someone of my age will remember taking over Keanu Reeves in Speed 2 to flaccid reception. Michael felt like a boy smitten by a lady friend and made terrible decisions, falling into multiple pitfalls even though there were instant red flags. As a son or a brother, he was fine, but when he knew that he had brought dangers to his loved ones, he managed to redeem himself. His younger brother Sam, played by the late Corey Haim, was more like the passionate protagonist to support and instrumental to resolve the vampire threat as much as he could, especially with the Frog Brothers, one of whom was Corey Feldman, who of course went on to form the two Coreys, who was some sort of sensation in their fleeting heydays. Diane Weiss, who won Academy Awards for Woody Allen's film in the year preceding The Lost Boys, played the mother Lucy, and she was wholesome in her character, wanting the best for her boys, yet trying to find new love before she was badly beaten, more figuratively than literally. After watching the movie, it was not difficult to fathom the charm of The Lost Boys had left in many people, especially if it was the first vampire movie they had watched, very much like Fright Night for me. In terms of scare factor, it came few and far between, but there were very few lull moments, and the movie successfully introduced the vampire laws to a new audience and felt like a movie that survived the test of time. This is an 8 out of 10 for me. Do you enjoy this slew of double horror movies review I have been delivering of late? If so, please give me a like and suggest what other double bill I should do in the future. Also hit the subscribe button in the meantime. The previous double bill feature was on contemporary space horror with William Kaufman's Or series and Flying Lotus Ash. See whether these movies can measure up to even the worst sequel of the Alien franchise. I wonder if I am 10 years old now and watched Abraham Boys as my first taste of a vampire movie, will it leave a scar in my memory? Highly unlikely.